with Ryan McGee from ESPN, the magazine. Ryan, thanks for hanging on over the break. We appreciate that. We wanted to ask you about Chris Economacki, who passed away this past week. And it was about 2 years ago or so that you had a chance to sit down with Chris. You talked to him. And give me your impression of Chris at 2 years ago and what he meant to you as far as a mentor in this business.
Well, I mean, 2 years ago, he came to Pocono, and his daughter Corinne, who was one of the forces behind the National Speed Sport News over this last couple of decades, his daughter Corinne had asked Dave Hart, who you guys have met. Dave's the director of public relations at Richard Childress
Right.
Racing. She had asked Dave and I to take her dad to dinner, and the two of us just, jumped at the chance. And so we went and picked him up there at the hotel at Pocono and took him to dinner, and he had never missed a Pocono race since the day they opened the racetrack. IndyCar, ARCA, NASCAR, whatever. He hadn't missed one. And so we took him to dinner, and it was almost like an out-of-body experience because it was just exactly what you would want it to be. He told stories, and he answered my stupid questions, like who's the greatest driver ever and who was the biggest jerk ever and all that stuff. He answered them all, and it was great. And, that night you could kind of – he turned 90 just a couple months later, and that night, for the first time ever, you kind of saw the signs of aging, And so on one hand, it was sad, but on the other hand, it was one of the best nights I ever had. And as far as, what he means to me, no one in our business on the media side, and honestly, even nobody's doing. None of us are doing what we're doing that haven't benefited from what Chris did.
Right.
And that's whether it's Speed Sport News or whether it's kind of inventing the notes column or whether it was going to the television networks and convincing them that they needed to spend money on motorsports, the Indy 500 and the Daytona 500. He's the guy that did that. He invented the pit reporter position.
Yeah.
And so everything that I do for a living, and the fact that I get paid to do it, is absolutely 100% due to the fact that Chris, broke the ground, so many years ago and continued to do it and was never afraid to speak his mind and made a lot of people mad, but they all respected him for it because he never pulled his punches. And if he had, it wouldn't have been Chris.
I think it's really telling when you say that none of us would do what we do if it weren't for him. But the fact is, and you say it, is that he is the guy that convinced everybody that racing had some importance. Because up until that point, racing was just this fringe thing that some wackos did. Some of them did it on ovals down in the South. Some of them did it on the streets up in the Northeast. Some of these guys over in Europe did it. But it was a sport for wackos. It wasn't a mainstream sport. And Chris Economacki was the guy who was able to convince television, like you said, convince even newspapers that this had some importance.
He is the one who walked into the rooms in New York at CBS and at ABC in particular and convinced them why World of Sports needs to be doing motorsports. Why World of Sports needs to be going to the Indianapolis 500. CBS Sports needs to televise the Daytona 500 from flag to flag. And, it's funny, when that deal was done, the course that led to the famous 1979 race, but when CBS did its first deal with NASCAR, Bill France Jr. and Sr. both said, well, we need to make sure you have somebody on your broadcast team that really knows what they're talking about. And they said, here's Ken Squire and here's Chris Economacki. Right. Anybody else you hire, whatever. And it's just, and that's how much respect they had for him, even though among their biggest critics that ever lived was Chris Economacki. But they appreciated that about him. So, yeah, you're right. I'm not saying that I couldn't be out there covering racing, but there's no way I could get paid for it like I get paid for it without what Chris Economacki did. So he'd be sorely missed, but his legacy, as long as they're racing cars and as long as there's people sitting in the media center, Chris Economacki's legacy will never die.
The other thing he did back in those, because I was watching that stuff back when he did it, and Wide World of Sports was where most of the auto racing, television auto racing coverage came from back then. There wasn't very much, and you didn't get a whole Wide World of Sports program to do the Grand Prix of Monaco or the Indian, or whatever they were doing, whatever stock car race they were doing that week. They'd get a 15 or 20 minute segment split up. It seems to me like split up maybe once or twice. And Economacki would get a couple of shots to say something, and he always just did it perfect. I mean, he brought off what auto racing was all about in very, very short sound bites, which they didn't call sound bites back then, and turned that into what we've got, like you say, what we have today.
Well, back in the old RPM Tonight days, when I was a producer, they sent us a bunch of old film reels from ABC in New York. They were basically cleaning closets.
Yeah.
And they sent us a box full of film reels that we had converted over to video, and it was the raw footage of Chris Economacki and a photographer, and they were covering. It was a July Daytona race. It was a Firecracker 400, and I want to say it was 67 or 68. I know Kelly Yarborough won the race, and I would sit there and just watch probably 6 reels of film, and I would sit there and watch them just as they were, and the only people covering that race were Chris Economacki, whoever had the film camera, and whoever was holding the microphone. That was it.
Yeah.
And they were down there covering the Firecracker 400 and would put together a big feature that they would run on Wild World of Sports that weekend. And I sit there and look at him, and there's no other media in the garage save for a writer or two. And then there's Chris hauling that big film camera around. And I asked him about it, and he said it's just a van. They drive down from New York. And it just had, a photographer and an audio guy and Chris and probably 15 bottles of bourbon. And they would load it up in the van and drive to Daytona. And they just, I look back on that, and it just was such admiration because they just were doing it. They were just doing it. It was rudimentary, but it was the only way they knew how to do it. And now I go in the TV compound, and between ESPN and Speed Channel and Fox and NASCAR Media Group, I mean, you guys have seen the television compound. It's a city. I mean, 15 trucks, and it's literally a city with a couple hundred people living in it. So it's just amazing to think about where Chris started and where we all are now.
All right, I got a minute. I know the answer to question number 1 that you asked him, who was the greatest driver you ever saw? He said A.J. Foyt. But then you said you asked him the other stupid question was, who was the biggest jerk he ever dealt with? I don't know that answer.
A.J. Foyt.
Yeah, same guy.
Same guy, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the way I phrased it, it was a bad word that I asked. Who was the biggest blank that you ever dealt with? He said same answer, A.J. Foyt.
Yeah.
And of course that's just classic Chris because it not only was it very accurate, it also was hilarious.
Yeah,
I bet.
Ryan, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot,
it,
Ryan.
man.
We appreciate the time and hanging over with us here and talking about Chris Economacki. We wouldn't have wanted to let this pass. So thanks, man. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it, guys. Anytime. Thanks.
All right, take care. That is Ryan.
Ryan McGee from ESPN the magazine, one of our favorites, and we didn't get a chance to